Oh, hello there. Yes, well, I'm the type of guy that doesn't like to wander around. Yeah, so I'm just going to stand here today. Anyway, today, very midweeky thing. Yes, my eye was drawn to a particular piece in Lord Young Boys, Toby Young's, come back to him. Yes, indeed, Daily Skeptic, yes, because he's sceptical about loads of things that people pay him to be sceptical about. Anyway, it was this: will Labour adopt the 10% limit on private school university places? Whereby a review of a book was happening, the book being Born to Rule, the making and remaking of the British elite, which is advocating, at least in part, that there should be a 10% limit on the Russell universities. They're the top ones where all the posh kids go, in terms of who they take from private schools. As they says here, the book arrives at a timely moment. No previous government would have looked seriously at these proposals. They mean the Conservatives. The current Labour government, already at war with private schools over VAT, may well be tempted to give them consideration. Okay, I'm not quite sure that makes sense. You're going to battle on two fronts. I don't know. There we go. As well as being, in my opinion, fundamentally unjust and unfair, like all affirmative action that puts aside the results of objective assessments, the consequences might be extremely limited. Might be, oh, yes, it might be really bad. Or not. Yeah, with major potential damage to private school sector, and is very successful in educating students and preparing them for higher education from which the nation as a whole benefits. Yes, you see, the reason why, of course, people put their kids into private school isn't to ensure that wealth stays at the top. It is, of course, to benefit us all. Where have we heard all that before? Which neatly brings us on to the book itself, which is I was so impressed by that particular blurb that I bought the book, waiting for it to arrive. I'll feedback if there's anything that's I haven't seen in the reviews. Anyway, the book itself is by a couple of sociologists from the LSE. So they're sociologists bad, but from the LSE. Ooh, hooray, it's hard to say, really. One of the things that sociologists like to do is to take stuff that we all know, but put it in academic tomes. It's that common sense thing. You'd be amazed about the amount of common sense there is that sociologists come out with, which people accept as common sense, but the moment it's said by a sociologist, it suddenly becomes somehow left-wing. So let's link down below. You can see a quick précis of their results and also an interview with the two authors. So let's have a look at this, okay? So their major findings, right, okay, were basically that there's been a shift, whereas, let's say 100 years ago, the wealthy elite were proud to show off their differences. You think about those Eton schoolboys in their top hats from like the 1930s, etc. There was this distinct class divide amongst even upper middle class types and the actual extremely wealthy aristocracy. Whereas these days, people don't like to think of themselves as being a member of the elite or wealthy, right? Okay, all of the wealthy people you will meet have managed to get there purely through their own success. It's got nothing to do with how wealthy their parents were. Boris Johnson was definitely the best person to be Prime Minister. David Cameron was definitely the best person to be Prime Minister. Come back to certainly at least one of those two anyway. So what they found was that when you ask people actually at the top, and they basically traced people through inherited wealth in who's who, we end up with this notion of what the actual rich people, leaving the word elite for the moment, believe. So 61% of them believed that they got where they were due to individual merit, right? Just on its own. That's the majority of them. Luck is 25%. They were just lucky to be where they are. And attending the best schools actually manages to get in, but not by many of them. And privileged upbringing and networking is the small amount there. Now, what you and I, of course, well know, and if any of you have ever met people from those particularly elite public schools like Eton, for example, you will get to see this in front of your face. Actually, the privileged upbringing and the networking, in many ways, are the absolute reasons why these people are why they are. All of them will swear blind that they're just ordinary people. That's a member, and what these two sociologists have found have basically been that that's what these members of the elite will now tell you Even if they don't realistically believe it themselves, it's become something that has to be said, right? So all of those members of the Conservative Party, or indeed members of the Labour Party, the Labour Party is more egalitarian, but those members of the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak had a nurse as a mum, just an ordinary bloke, right? And James Cleverly has a whole bunch of horses, or was that Nadim's? No, it's Nadim Zawahiri. I get them wrong. Yeah, Nadim came here as a penniless immigrant who now has a whole bunch of stables. Not utterly convinced. There's an old saying in American politics that every single presidential candidate lives in a log cabin that they were born in and built themselves, which is where we come up to this thing. But of course, what it does is basically hides exactly what's going on. It's the truth that must not be said. So, for example, if a new book comes out that might well create a bit of a splash, then you have to slag it off. I don't really know particularly why the Daily Skeptic's done that, but they just are involved in that kind of business whereby nothing must change. So here's Henry, as they quote, "Complete rubbish. I've never considered myself to be one of the elite. I considered myself, justifiably or not, to have been a successful professional. I don't consider that elite. This belief is that there is an elite that can dominate society. I have considerable doubts about that." Yes, indeed, you see, because anybody can join the elite, and every once in a while you get to point at them, yeah? However, there are, as I say, issues with that. You think about the number of Etonians that there are who have become prime ministers, vast numbers. You think about all of those Labour leaders who didn't come from particularly ordinary backgrounds. And certainly, until very recently with the Labour landslide, the numbers of public school educated MPs were astonishingly high. Yeah. Now, why do they do this? Why do they do this? Well, it's just to pretend that we live in somehow a meritocratic system, that magically anybody can become president. Again, just to use an Americanism. But of course, realistically, I mean, if we go back to David Cameron and Boris Johnson, and here's that classic shot, which they weren't, remember the newspapers were basically threatened with dreadful sanctions if they dared publish this photograph back in the 2010 election. Here they are. All of the people in these photographs are now in positions where they will have a distinct impact, or will have had a distinct impact on your life. All of them. The ones you don't recognise are still at the head of FTSE 100 companies, okay? Yeah, that's your meritocracy for you. Their parents paid that vast amount of money to ensure that their children would not fail. That's basically what it is. If we truly lived in a democracy, and I'm a very keen exponent of the notion of democracy, we wouldn't put up with this. Anyway, the other things in the book, so let's look at what the authors say about their other recommendations. We have several suggestions in the book. One is a wealth tax to break, or at least weaken, the link between wealth and elite reproduction to give a fair opportunity to many more people to get into positions of power and influence. Yeah, that one thing the Labour Party won't do. Why? Because it's too threatening, and that really would bring out the army on the streets. And I'm not joking about that. Don't forget that when Jeremy Corbyn was proposing to shift the balance of power, some of their other recommendations do that, we basically had an interview on Newsnight with a member of the armed forces who did suggest that there might be issues. So much for our democracy. Anyway, some of their other ones. Another recommendation is to reconfigure the trajectories that have dominated access to elite positions. We propose changing the admission process to elite universities to limit the number of private educated students at Russell Group universities to 10% of their incoming cohort, the same proportion of the British population that ever attended private school. Okay, so basically, as it is at the moment, it's nothing particularly radical. It's just suggesting that we do definitely need to not make it any more than that. This would reduce the proportion of privately educated students in Russell Group universities by about 50%, quell demand for public schools, and remake the important ways the trajectories that have allowed people to get in positions of power and influence. Yes, you see, but you'll notice that the Daily Skeptic person, Dr. whatever his name is against that, because he argues that you mustn't have quotas. We can't have quotas. We mustn't do anything. Even though you can see the way that this would radically alter admissions into those universities and would have a very large impact on the old boy network, which is precisely why, of course, it must be rejected, because even though it's a lot more meritocratic, we mustn't be meritocratic. We must merely pretend to be meritocratic, yes. Moving on, we propose mechanisms that aim to redistribute power in big organisations and key institutions that currently sits with those at the top. We propose putting more workers in the boards of corporations so that you don't become so you don't have to become the CEO to influence over how a company is run. Yes. Democratising the workplace is one of the things that John McDonnell was very, very keen on, and obviously, once again, you can see how threatening that is, because after all, working class people are too stupid to actually understand how to run a business, unless, of course, they can run a business, in which case we won't talk about it. Now, it's astounding to me that we live in a society where we are expected to fully believe in democracy, and yet we don't have votes at work. And we're told, in many ways, that the votes we do get at work in terms of trade unions are somehow very, very bad. Odd that, isn't it? Yeah. We believe in democracy. At work? No. We argue for quite a radical change to the government. We would remove all hereditary peerages and replace the House of Lords with a Senate drawn from a random selection of the population. This would enable ordinary people to have more proactive say over government policy making, as well as through the ballot box. Yeah, imagine that. You can just see how, oh my God, that's way, way, way too threatening. We couldn't do that. But, of course, what we're told instead about the elites is that they basically magically exist as a group of left-wingers in the media. That's it, isn't it? It's your Matt Goodwin line. It's your Jacob Rees-Mogg line. Oh, yes, the elites are other people. They're not blokes that live in a castle that make millions each year. Oh, good grief, no. That's not the new elites. The new elites are all left-wing people like Gary Lineker. Yeah, it's always Gary Lineker, isn't it? Or somehow magically Owen Jones because he went to Oxford. Yeah, I know, but he was a working-class kid. But if you actually look at the prime ministers, for example, over the last few years, almost all of them have come from that certainly upper middle class background. Theresa May and John Major are probably the reasonable standouts from that. And for me, the classic one of this is David Cameron. Do you remember when people used to wear those bands? You often used to see them. I mean, women that used to work in supermarkets and kids got into them, where you have about 3 or 4 bands for fighting cancer and stuff. I remember him, David Cameron, sitting with a group of, I think they were nurses, and he kept fiddling with this thing because he'd been told to show this particular band because it showed what a nice, caring human being he was. Yes, it's a game. Okay, and of course you mustn't know the rules to the game, and we certainly mustn't change the rules. But imagine a party coming in that just pushed for even just one of those changes and how profound it might be, and what a big effect it would have. Because already we do have a lot of young people that go to very successful state schools that are getting more and more university places on merit. It isn't about a quota and allocation to a certain extent. But you have to ask yourself, why is it that they are so against real merit? And the answer is so that we don't see them. And yet, I do. And I'll let you know about them. Anyway, do have a lovely, midweeky day. Enjoy.